Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling a monumental text to investigate a question that philosophers have literally wrestled with for centuries. We're diving into Francis Fukuyama's incredibly influential book, The End of History and the Last Man. We'll unpack his fascinating deep dive into whether human history actually has a coherent direction, and maybe even more importantly, what exactly happens to us when we finally reach its ideological end.
Okay, let's jump right into the central mystery guiding our entire investigation today. Is human history actually moving forward? Are we really progressing towards some final destination? Or are we just spinning our wheels, doomed to repeat the exact same triumphs and tragedies over and over again? It's a massive question, right? And to truly grasp Fukuyama's answer, we first need to look at how our collective perspective on this has drastically shifted over time.
Which brings us to Section 1, 20th Century Historical Pessimism. To understand our modern outlook on history, we've got to look back a bit. Now, in the 19th century, there was this widespread, incredibly hopeful belief that human history was clearly moving forward. People honestly thought modern science was going to conquer disease and poverty, and that free, democratic governments would just naturally spread across the globe. But then, the brutal reality of the 20th century hit, and it completely shattered that optimism. Instead of saving us, science actually fueled unprecedented destruction. Let's look at exactly how those expectations were shattered. The trauma of the 20th century taught humanity a terrifying lesson. Economic and technological advancement is absolutely no guarantee against human evil. You look at the pointless, grinding slaughter of World War I trench warfare, which totally discredited the old political order. Then we saw the rise of massive totalitarian states, backed by modern police power. We witnessed the unthinkable horrors of the Holocaust, which emerged not in some backward society, but in an advanced industrial economy. And of course, we were left living under the looming existential shadow of nuclear weapons. So if science just gives us better tools to destroy ourselves, how on earth can we say history is moving forward? That leads us to Section 2. Is history moving forward? Well, despite all that overwhelming pessimism, the end of the Cold War really forced a reevaluation. And this is exactly where Francis Fukuyama comes in. Writing right at the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama invites us to look at this remarkable worldwide consensus that was emerging at the time. He pointed out that strong dictatorships on both the right and the left were completely collapsing, leaving liberal democracy as pretty much the only coherent political aspirations spanning the globe. He suggests, maybe this isn't just a happy accident. Maybe, just maybe, it's the actual endpoint for mankind's ideological evolution. So the crucial point here is whether we can construct what philosophers like to call a universal history. Now, this isn't just some giant encyclopedia of everything that ever happened. No, it's an attempt to find a meaningful, directional pattern in how human societies develop. Great philosophers like Kant and Hegel explored this heavily, constantly looking for a progressive path. Fukuyama argues that to build this universal history, we've got to recognize two powerful forces, or motors as he calls them, that consistently drive humanity forward. Let's explore that in Section 3, the engine of science. The very first of these motors is the logic of modern natural science, and let me tell you, it is absolutely unstoppable. For starters, it's cumulative and directional, meaning you simply cannot uninvent the scientific method. But more importantly, it forces societies to evolve in a totally uniform way, because technology gives countries decisive military advantages. Basically, if you want to defend yourself, you literally have to modernize. Plus, it establishes a uniform horizon of economic production. It creates a global consumer culture that inherently pushes nations toward capitalism, mainly because highly centralized command economies simply can't keep up with complex information-based post-industrial growth. They just fall behind. However, as incredibly powerful as this engine of science is, it does have a massive blind spot. While this first motor perfectly explains why we all want complex post-industrial economies and why societies start to look more uniform, it cannot explain why we strive for democratic governments that guarantee basic human rights. Think about it. If we were strictly economic animals, we'd be perfectly happy living under a well-managed, wealthy, and efficient dictatorship, right? So there must be something else driving history forward. And that brings us to Section 4, the struggle for recognition. This missing link brings us to a brilliant concept from ancient philosophers like Plato, and later Hegel, called thymos. It's essentially the spirited part of the soul, our deep, innate human sense of justice and self-esteem. To put it in perspective, think about that sudden, visceral anger you feel when someone blatantly cuts in front of you in line. That right there, that's your thymos demanding that others recognize your dignity. When you're treated as worthless, thymos produces anger. When you fail to meet your own standards, it produces shame. And when you're recognized correctly, it gives you a profound sense of pride.
So how exactly does this thymos drive history forward? Well, according to Hegel, right at the beginning of history, humans engaged in this literal bloody battle for pure prestige. They were literally risking their lives just to be recognized by someone else. And this resulted in a society divided into masters and slaves. But as you can probably guess, this dynamic was inherently flawed. The slave got zero recognition, and the master was only recognized by a slave, which isn't exactly a satisfying ego boost. So history is forced to move forward because we eventually, inevitably, demand a system where everyone's dignity is acknowledged equally.
This brings us to a foundational idea from Hegel himself. He viewed history not just as a random, chaotic series of events, but as a dialectical struggle. Basically, that means flawed systems inevitably contradict themselves, they fall apart, and then they're replaced by higher, better systems, repeating until true freedom is finally realized. History, in his eyes, is simply the progress of this consciousness. Let's look at the culmination of this in Section 5, the end of history. So, what actually happens when we synthesize these two motors of science and recognition? Well, Fukuyama's thesis gained immense intellectual traction because it didn't just report on the collapse of communism. It offered a deeply original meaning to the whole thing. It suggested that the triumph of the liberal democratic ideal wasn't just some stroke of geopolitical luck. No, it was the logical culmination of the entire human story. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly why capitalist liberal democracy just might be the final form of human government. It totally resolves that ancient master-slave contradiction by granting universal and reciprocal recognition to everyone through the rule of law. Crucially, it satisfies both of our historical motors at once. It fulfills the economic logic of science through capitalism, and it satisfies that thematic desire for dignity through democracy. It essentially represents a society completely free from those fundamental internal contradictions that destroy other systems. Which obviously leads us to a massive question. If our current political system is actually completely satisfying to human beings in their most essential characteristics, then has the historical process as an ideological evolution effectively ended? I mean, sure, we might still have events, wars, elections, technological breakthroughs, but the evolution of the underlying principles of how we should govern ourselves, that might be over. We may have literally reached the end of history.
But before we celebrate, we need to look at Section 6, the last man.
Yeah, before we go popping the champagne, we have to confront a pretty dark twist introduced by the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He warned that this kind of universal equality might produce what he called the last man. This is a citizen of a modern democracy who basically gives up any prideful belief in his own superior worth, trading it all in for comfortable self-preservation. He's a person composed entirely of basic desires and calculation, but completely lacks the thymus required to strive for excellence or to achieve anything daring. He is, as Nietzsche put it, a man without a chest. This sets up a truly terrifying contrast for us to ponder. On one side, we have megalothymia, which is the irrational desire to be recognized as superior to others. Now, make no mistake, this is the very thing that causes imperialism, dictatorships, and bloody wars. But it is also the core engine driving towering human ambition, innovation, and great art. On the flip side, we have the last man, content, peaceful, calculating, and completely lacking any desire to rise above his petty wants. So, if we eliminate those bloody battles for superior recognition just to achieve peace, do we also accidentally eliminate the very essence of human greatness? Do we just become comfortable, satisfied animals? And that brings us right back to our ultimate focus for today. Is human history truly moving forward to a place of permanent rest? If liberal democracy perfectly satisfies our rational needs for peace and prosperity, will we actually accept it? Or is there a darker side to human nature? A boredom, a restless desire for struggle that will eventually lead us to rebel against this perfect system, plunging the world back into the chaos of history just to seek out unequal recognition? It is a fascinating, almost haunting paradox to consider. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I hope this leaves you with a completely new lens to view the direction of human history.